What is the longest automobile race you've ever heard of? How long did it last, and how far did the drivers travel? And no, I'm not talking about marathon Twitch streams of Mario Kart. The longest NASCAR race runs for a little under 620 miles. 24 Hours of Le Mans runs for more than 3,000 miles. But what if I told you that in 1908, 6 cars competed in a race around the world from New York to Paris for a total distance of 22,000 miles? The 1908 race from New York to Paris was an unfathomable 6-month journey that brought the United States, France, Germany, and Italy together. And it's a race that remains one of the longest in recorded history, featuring dangerous road conditions, an armed standoff straight out of an action movie, infighting among the teams, a full-on cheating scandal, and an ending that's almost too outrageous to believe. A finish so manifestly unbelievable you would get laughed out of Hollywood for putting it in your script. So, who won the race? How on earth did they even plan to get from New York to Paris in the first place? Luckily, this story won't take 6 months to tell, so strap in because where we're going, we don't need roads. Well, actually we do, but because it's 1908, they mostly don't exist yet. This is RCR Stories. New York to Paris, 1908. The legendary race. On February 12, 1908, more than 250,000 people lined the streets of Times Square to witness the beginning of the greatest race known to man. Co-sponsored by the New York Times and French newspaper Le Matin, the race from New York to Paris seemed to exist solely for bragging rights, and a 1,400-pound trophy cast in bronze. Yeah, I'm not sure what they were even really supposed to do with that. Maybe melt it down, sell it for money? But whatever, it may not have been much, but it was something. But to be honest, there was more in it for the newspapers than for the racers themselves, as the publications stood to make a lot of money off of race coverage. There would also be a promotional benefit to the auto industry as well. Races like these could provide a shot in the arm to boost sales and make cars more desirable, and even standardize them in the eyes of a public where, in some areas, people hadn't even seen a car up close before. Now, there was already proof that this worldwide race concept could work. A race had been run from Peking to Paris the year before, in a journey that made international headlines for being won by an Italian aristocrat. But this would be an even bigger race, and it would be a truly international effort. So the calculated distance of the trip was estimated to be roughly 19,877 miles, and it would take contestants from the starting line in New York City to the first checkpoint in Chicago, Illinois, and then south towards Omaha, Nebraska, and then west towards the second checkpoint of San Francisco, California, at which point the cars and racers would travel by ship to Seattle, Washington, and then to Valdez, Alaska. They would then drive across Alaska until they reached the Bering Strait. Since the race was planned to begin in winter, the assumption was that the Bering Strait would be completely frozen. And so the drivers were expected to drive across the frozen water to get to the next phase of the race, which would basically be a journey across Eastern Asia towards France. A daunting trip with a daunting price tag, as the cost for each participant was approximately $10,000, which comes out to over $351,000 in 2025. Now, let's talk about the teams. They were as follows. Italy was represented by driver Giulio Sirtori, although some sources list his name as Emilio Sirtori. He operated a car by the Italian automaker Zust. His partners for the race would be mechanic Heinrich Haga and 21-year-old poet and journalist Antonio Scarfolio, whose father had forbidden him from participating in the race until Scarfolio threatened to drive a motorboat across the Atlantic if he didn't let him compete. What a fun threat. A German news publication, meanwhile, had sponsored a car that was built specifically for the race by automaker Protos just 2 months earlier, and it would be driven by 31-year-old Lieutenant Hans Koppen, who requested a special leave of absence from the 15th Prussian Infantry to represent Germany in the contest. Now, Koppen had high hopes, as he supposedly believed that a victory in the race would lead to a military promotion, since he'd been a second lieutenant for a while now. He'd also put a lot of his own money into preparation for the race, so he arguably had the most skin in the game out of anybody actually driving in this race. Meanwhile, France would have 3 entrants in the competition. The first was Guy Boursier de Saint-Chaffray, a 36-year-old aristocrat who drove a car made by automaker De Dion, and his team included mechanic Alphonse Autrin and a Norwegian adventurer named Hans Hendrik Hansen, who was said to have sailed a Viking ship to the North Pole. With no crew. Just all on his own, which sounds like something lifestyle influencers would try to do and then quit after they ran out of pipeline punch flavored Monster. And let's talk about this French aristocrat Saint-Chaffray. And don't worry about having to remember all of these names, I'll be constantly reminding you who everyone is. You see, Saint-Chaffray didn't really have the greatest reputation to start with. Not only had he declared himself a commissioner of the race, he made the dubious claim of having had a role in charting the route the racers would take. Although I guess it isn't that dubious, considering the man was known for hosting extravagant racing events back in Europe. Except, well, that wasn't really a good thing. Saint-Chaffray had become internationally infamous for having organized a motorboat race across the Mediterranean in which every single boat sank to the bottom of the sea. And while I can't find evidence that anybody died, nobody died at Firefest either. But it didn't really help the reputation of Ja Rule and Billy What's-His-Face either. So yeah, a controversial entrant, to say the least. But Saint-Chaffray was arguably less controversial than France's second entrant, a motoblock driven by a 31-year-old baron named Charles Godard. He had competed in the legendary Peking to Paris race the year before, but didn't finish because he was arrested for conning a Dutch consulate into giving him gas money with false promises that his sponsor would pay them back. Which proves that even 118 years ago, the world still had gas mooches. For whatever reason that I cannot explain, Godard was allowed to ride along for the final leg of the journey to Paris. But then he tried to forcibly take control of the wheel from his car's new driver in order to finish the race himself, at which point police had him removed from the vehicle and sent off to serve his 18-month prison sentence. And I know, you're thinking, if he was sentenced to prison for 18 months in 1907, how is he here captaining a 3-man team for France 6 months later? And honestly, I don't know. I looked to try to figure out, what, did he get off for good behavior? Or was it like, I don't know, did somebody pay off what he owed for him or something? Either way, he's here now, and he's in this race. Maybe the law just works differently when you're a baron. Now, by comparison, France's third entrant was practically a glass of warm milk, as French automaker Césaire Naudin would be represented by 32-year-old Auguste Pons and his crew, a pair of 24-year-old mechanics. Which might sound young, but you gotta remember age inflation. 24 then is basically like 47 now. Last but not least, there was the United States entrant. And the story is important here because up until 3 days before the race, there was no United States entrant. And with good reason. Major companies like Ford and Cadillac didn't feel the reward of additional publicity was worth risking the shame of a potential loss. So America would need a smaller automaker to step up to the plate, and that was kind of a big ask due to the expense involved in competing. Enter a man by the name of Edwin Ross Thomas, who was the proprietor of the E.R. Thomas Motor Company in Buffalo, New York. Thomas was having a really hard time selling his inventory of cars, which included the 4-cylinder, 60-horsepower touring car known as the Thomas Flyer. Thomas figured competing in the race could help get the company's name out there and boost sales numbers, so a 1907 Thomas Flyer was yanked from the company inventory and officially entered just 3 days before the race was set to start, which still blows my mind. 3 days! It takes longer for a teenager to call the shop back with his decision on whether he wants the windows tinted or not. The answer is always yes. Thomas then hired 24-year-old race car driver Montague Roberts to captain his team. He would be joined by Harold Brinker, a fellow race car driver from Denver, and George Schuster, an incredibly talented 35-year-old Thomas Motor Company mechanic, who Thomas badly wanted on the team. The only problem was that, because Thomas entered a car so late into the process, Schuster was given only a single day's notice to decide whether or not to participate, and considering he had a family, it was kind of a huge ask to commit to being away from home for months on a journey that offered no guarantee of safety. But Schuster agreed, and with that, the teams were set. But right from the start, this race was a complete disaster, and while we would eventually have a winner, and cars would make it to Paris, not everyone would even make it out of New York. On that morning of February 12th, 1908, with 250,000 people there to witness the start of the race firsthand, delays caused major frustration among racers and spectators alike. The cars were set to roll out at 11 a.m. sharp, but Mayor George B. McClellan Jr., who was supposed to fire the starting pistol, had a reputation for being cartoonishly late all the time. So when 11 a.m. came and went with no mayor in sight, one of the businessmen on hand just grabbed the pistol and shot the damn thing into the air himself, signaling the official start of the race. And just like that, the 6 cars were on their way. The plan was to leave Broadway and 42nd Street and go north towards Albany, and then once free of New York State, it should be a fairly clear shot across the Midwest, venturing south and then westward towards San Francisco. 42 days later. When the Thomas Flyer entered San Francisco in the lead, it wasn't the 24-year-old hotshot Montague Roberts at the wheel, but Harold Brinker, with mechanic George Schuster riding shotgun, along with an entirely new teammate. A lot had happened in the preceding month, yet for as miserable an experience as the journey had been up to that point, you could argue the Thomas Flyer had it better than most. Let's rewind. So shortly after the race had started, the cars quickly encountered snow that was over a foot deep in Hudson, New York. So with all the snow, the cars were very slow moving, and it made for an odd spectacle. Men would come out and try to advise the drivers on how to get their cars out of the drifts, while mischievous kids would rain snowballs down on them because little kids are jerks sometimes, no matter which century we're in. Except at least the drivers in 1908 were spared the indignity of having the entire thing posted to TikTok. Despite being bundled up to their noses, it was still bitterly cold, even by the standards of a northeastern February. And these cars didn't exactly have heated seats, you know? Or heating, period. To make matters worse, they weren't using antifreeze either, since it wouldn't become commercially available for cars for another 18 years. So the mechanic on each team would have to literally drain the radiator before settling in at the end of the night to prevent them freezing. Yet it wouldn't be the Radiator that claimed the first team of the race. Mechanical troubles took out one of France's 3 teams within the first 96 miles of the race, as the César Naudin suffered a broken differential and had to drop out. In an instant, 6 teams had become 5. The Thomas Flyer was the first car to get out of New York and break through to Ohio, followed by the Italian Zust car and the De Dion, driven by French aristocrat Saint-Chaffré, who had been eager to catch up with the Americans in Ohio before deciding to take it a bit easier in the early going of the race. German Lieutenant Koppen, meanwhile, took the opposite approach and paid for it. Pushing his Protos car had resulted in mechanical troubles rearing their miserable head during the New York leg, and in the time it took to fix the issues, the gap between the German team and the other competitors widened, which had Lieutenant Koppen stressed the hell out, since Kaiser Wilhelm II was said to be following the race. France's other remaining car, driven by the notorious Baron Charles Godard, was also getting the short end of the stick. Godard had found his team priced out of lodging in a lot of places along the route, and this is where you could kind of argue that the race was straight up unfair. You see, towns along the way essentially knew they had all the leverage since the racers relied on hardware stores for fuel and local inns for food and rest, and they didn't have the luxury of trying their luck in the next town if they didn't have the fuel to get there, or if they were too poorly rested to even try. So these merchants would price gouge these guys, charging them outrageous prices. I'm talking DLC that should have been part of the base game prices. Obviously, this favored the more well-funded teams, yet it arguably hit no one harder than it hit Godard and the Motoblock team, and nowhere worse than in Indiana, as the French team accepted the hospitality of a farmer who served them a chicken dinner and then charged them $3 for it. Now that might not sound like much, but $3 in 1908 is equivalent to a 2025 value of $105 for 2 chickens. It wasn't even like they laid golden eggs to be able to justify these prices. And of course, Godard was outraged and demanded to know why this farmer was charging them such an indefensible price. At which point the farmer implied it was for emotional distress since the chickens he served them were pet chickens his kids played with. Never mind the fact that nobody forced this man to do this. Meanwhile, the Thomas Flyer was in the lap of luxury by comparison, clearing the first checkpoint in Chicago and being greeted in Omaha, Nebraska with a hot meal and a fresh change of warm clothes that included corduroy pants and raccoon coats, all free of charge. So yeah, I'd be mad too if I were Godard. And so, looking for a way to change their shoddy luck, the Motoblock team sent a dispatch to the Chicago Automobile Club, in the hopes that the club would help improve their perception in the community. The dispatch stated, quote, "We are discouraged. The peasants demand $3 per mile for helping us. They charged $5 each to permit us to sleep on the ground. Peasants along the way have filled up road dug by leading cars so as to help the Thomas car. Would it be possible to influence public opinion to aid us?" End quote. The Chicago Tribune got hold of the note, and it did succeed in getting the Motoblock team press coverage. But yeah, they pretty much ragged on the team for their pathetic appeal and made them even more unpopular in the eyes of locals. Motoblock was struggling, and Godard was out of ideas on how to catch up with the American Thomas Flyer and the Italian Zust car. Until he had an idea with the potential to turn the entire race on its head. The United States had really bad road infrastructure. I'm talking just huge swaths of land with no trodden road, much less any paved roads. So cars were constantly getting stuck in mud, they were running aground in ditches, and having to be pulled out by men and horses. It was really rough going. But Godard noticed that what the United States lacked in paved roads, they made up for with their rail system. So he came up with a plan to load the motoblock onto a train and ride it all the way to San Francisco. It was quick-witted. It was genius. And it was basically a violation of literally the only rule the race even had. You couldn't use trains to make the journey for you. It should have been common sense. It would have been like showing up to the Tour de France on a Yamaha. Of course, Godard knew this, but figured if he was careful enough, no one would ever have to know. Except this is the same Baron Charles Godard who wasn't even a year removed from getting caught scamming the Dutch. So sure enough, as he was loading the motoblock onto a train, a newspaper photographer caught him in the act. And while he may have been swearing off local chicken, Godard's goose was definitely cooked. Once the story hit the papers, he received a cable from his sponsors. Just 7 short words. Quit race, sell car, and come home. The motoblock team had just been disqualified. France was down to just 1 representative out of the 3 they had when the race started. Only 4 teams were left, and the cars were on the verge of entering into the most perilous part of the journey so far, the mountainous western subregion of the United States. The Italian Zeus car was making good time across Wyoming until they arrived in an area near Spring Valley one evening. The Zeus driver, Giulio Sertori, thought he heard a crying child, but as the night air stilled, the sound was replaced by something clearer and closer. The telltale howling of a wolf. Howling that doubled, tripled, quadrupled. Dozens of wolves. Too many wolves to count. Literally the boss fight from hell, going after a bunch of duplicate enemies with really shoddy hitboxes. Sertori and the journalist-poet Antonio Scarfolio, who probably wished by this point that he'd just listened to his father and stayed home, tried to get the pack to scatter, first by blowing the car horn, and then by flashing the car's spotlight. But none of this worked, so the 2 men and mechanic Heinrich Haga decided they were going to risk it all in one last desperate move, reaching for the trunk to retrieve some guns they'd brought for protection. Somehow, the men managed to do this without being torn to shreds, and once they were armed, they just started firing and reloading, firing and reloading, and kept firing until they ran out of bullets, by which point the remaining wolves had run off, and the hungry ones who remained were no longer paying attention to the Zeus team, because they were busy devouring their fallen brethren. It sounds utterly unbelievable, like something out of an action horror movie, yet the story was corroborated by citizens of the nearby town the next day, who decided to cash in on it by heading to the scene of the battle to collect the pelts from all of those fallen wolves. The Italians continued on their way, hoping to put the whole incident behind them. But not all guns were fired in fear and desperation. Upon arriving in Cheyenne, Wyoming, the Thomas Flyer was greeted by cowboys and cowgirls on horses firing guns into the air in celebration. Children were let out of school early in anticipation of the team's arrival, and many of the townsfolk had the chance to see a real live car in person for the first time. But the arrival was bittersweet, as Montague Roberts, the 24-year-old driver for the Americans, had to leave the team due to having previously signed up to compete in the Grand Prix, which coincidentally enough was being held in Paris. He would be replaced for a brief spell by pioneering motorsport racer and Thomas Motors dealer E. Lynn Mathewson, who carried the team through the rest of Wyoming and across much of Utah before Harold Brinker took the team the rest of the way to San Francisco. At this point, the Thomas Flyer had a full 7-day lead over their nearest competitor, the Zeus car, and that lead would only expand in the days to come. But German Lieutenant Hans Koppen would have considered himself lucky to be 7 days away, as he'd fallen catastrophically far behind. His Protos car was continuously breaking down, and his teammates were positively fed up, telling him he could either quit the race now or find himself a new crew. Considering the Kaiser was following the race, and his personal money was tied up in this, quitting simply wasn't an option for the lieutenant. But what could he do without a crew? Author J.M. Fenster, in a 1996 article for American Heritage magazine titled The Longest Race, details what Koppen did next. Quote, "He couldn't go on without a teammate, however, so he acted swiftly, if rather desperately, telegraphing an opera singer he knew in Germany. She gave him the name of her husband's ex-chauffeur, then living in America. Finally, Lieutenant Koppen and his new chauffeur left Chicago on the trail of the Thomas. But they found themselves continually held up in Iowa, not just by the muddy gumbo that had caught the other cars, but by something even stickier. German-American social clubs in nearly every town that insisted on celebrating the Protos with banquets and speeches." End quote. Yet, believe it or not, the roster changes still weren't done, as the French aristocrat Guy Boursier de Saint-Chaufré was butting heads with his Norwegian teammate, the Arctic adventurer Hans Hansen. You see, they clashed on everything from how to proceed through the snowdrifts to just what Saint-Chaufré even brought to the team, since his crew did the real work of digging the car out whenever they got stuck, while Saint-Chaufré sat behind the steering wheel, eating and delegating. Hansen had even threatened to toss him out of the car in Chicago if he didn't check his lousy attitude. And this eventually came to a head in the American West, which is fitting because they decided to settle the score with a good old-fashioned duel. But as Hansen and Saint-Chaufré went to find their pistols to put an end to this once and for all, the aristocrat basically said, "You know what? I don't have to do this. I'm the nephew of the Marquis de Dion. I'm the leader of this team, so you're fired." You'd think this would be the end of the line for our Norwegian outdoorsman, Hansen, but you would be wrong, because the Thomas Flyer was down a man after having lost Montague Roberts and his replacement, E. Lynn Mathewson, who'd withdrawn after Ogden, Utah. So Hansen jumped ship, defecting to the American team, which made it to San Francisco a little over a month after the race began. The Thomas Flyer was in the lead and on a ship bound for Seattle, with plans to head onward to Alaska to drive across the frozen surface of the Bering Strait. And if you think you know who gets to Paris first, well, don't go placing any bets just yet. So yeah, driving across the Bering Strait wasn't going to happen, and it's ludicrous that anybody in the Parisian race committee ever thought it could. Yes, there had been rumors and assumptions that once the Bering Strait freezes over, you're able to get across it on a sled, presumably. And it would be done 100 years after this. So once the Thomas Flyer had arrived in Valdez, Alaska, after their long boat trip, mechanic George Schuster went ahead on a one-horse sleigh to ascertain the condition of the roads, and found that not only would it be impossible to cross the Bering Strait, it would be impossible for the cars to even make it across Alaska. There was just nowhere for these cars to go. So the race committee made the call to abandon Alaska altogether and instead sail to Vladivostok, Russia by way of Japan. Great news for everyone else, bad news for the Americans. Being so much farther ahead meant that they were the only team to go to Alaska, and that boat trip to Seattle, and then to Alaska, and then Seattle again, cost precious time for the Thomas Flyer, to where they not only lost their nearly 2-week lead, but fell behind significantly, and the team suffered further frustrations as George Schuster had begun to butt heads with driver Harold Brinker. Historians would note that Schuster was largely the reason the car had made it as far as it had. For instance, over the course of the race, he would repair the broken frame by using boilerplate steel to keep everything together. He would drill 2 holes into the flywheel during another repair, and he would walk alone for miles to find gas or spare parts while his teammates remained with the car. Yet for that first American leg of the race, Schuster was an unsung hero who got fewer mentions in the papers than his more popular teammates, which now included Hans Hansen and a riding mechanic named George Miller. Schuster believed he could get the team the rest of the way and campaigned to take the helm. And that's ultimately what he did, but he was taking over at a time when the complexion of the race had changed. Incredibly, the Thomas Flyer was now in last place, but even more astonishing was the German Protos car's comeback, as Lieutenant Koppen was already crossing the Pacific, but not before nearly being disqualified due to a supposed misunderstanding. Basically, the comeback wasn't as miraculous as it seemed on the surface. After the millionth time the Protos had broken down, Lieutenant Koppen decided to leave the car in Utah and hop on a train to Seattle to get parts for it. But once he got the parts, he decided to have the car shipped to him in Seattle by train, unaware of the rules forbidding this, and I presume the reason he may have overlooked this was because he and the car didn't travel together on the same train, so maybe he thought it was okay, or maybe he thought that because the car was inoperable when it was transported, that was alright. Either way, he repaired the car and drove to San Francisco, then hopped on a ship from there. The Parisian Race Committee assessed the situation and decided that this wasn't an intentional attempt to cheat the system like Baron Godard had tried to do. However, a penalty would still need to be levied against him, so they decided that Koppen would receive a 15-day penalty, meaning even if, through some act of God or comedy, the German team made it to Paris before everyone else, the only way they would be declared the winner was if they managed to do it 15 days before everyone else. Compounding this was the decision by the committee that the Americans would be granted a 15-day advantage in recognition of the lead they lost for having to go through Alaska when nobody else had to. This meant that as long as the Thomas Flyer made it to Paris fewer than 15 days after everyone else, they would be declared the winner. And the benefit doubled to 30 days if the first car to Paris was the German Protos car. So the Parisian Race Committee had just handed the Americans a huge boost. Or maybe they just leveled the playing field back to where it had been. Either way, it was still going to be a tough challenge, as Saint-Chaffrey and the De Dion had already crossed Japan, as had the Zust car. Both were well on their way across Siberia by the time the Americans caught up and faced another delay when they ran into visa issues in Russia. The odds were getting longer for the Americans. But they would be able to catch up. The road conditions would just have to cooperate. And hey, Siberia couldn't possibly be worse than the endless snowdrifts of America, right? No. The entire westward trip across the continent of Asia was filled with peril and uncooperative biomes in a journey that stretched into late May and early June. Cars found themselves stuck in swampy marshes, deep mud, bitter snows, and punishing heat, in lands where roads were basically even less existent than they were in America. Teams went days without seeing another car, and to make matters worse, there were bandits on the prowl. The news had made it clear that drivers were passing through as part of the grand New York to Paris race, and the presumption was that because they were national heroes to their respective countries, they could be worth a considerable ransom if taken. Manchurian authorities learned of these potential ransom plots from 3 bandits who were captured en route, and it drew a clear correlation between the racers' fame and the amount of danger that fame could bring them. Case in point, when the Thomas Flyer arrived in a small village called Manchuria, snow had melted to reveal the bodies of 30 men whose lives had been taken by bandits. It wasn't exactly a place anybody wanted to stop, but the car needed replacement parts, so Schuster left on one of his long treks by foot to go find some, leaving his team with the Flyer. They were eventually discovered by armed men who approached the Thomas Flyer team, getting in close with their pack of guard dogs, to offer the Americans some extra bullets for their pistols and a couple bayonets for protection, along with a stern lecture about how stupid it was to light a campfire in an area where bandits were actively looking for people to rob, which is sound advice, although I would argue the fact that they were in an American touring car would be a bigger neon sign than any campfire. But as the teams trekked further west, the lack of road infrastructure became too big to ignore. The racers had no choice but to use the Trans-Siberian Railroad to cross the most treacherous terrain, and the teams received special permission to do this, and as transport was arranged, the teams stayed at a hotel to rest, recuperate, and refuel their cars, which proved a bit of a challenge since fuel was really hard to come by in this area. But it was still a welcome break because it allowed for all the cars to catch up so that, for the first time since New York, everyone would start on equal footing. But the De Dion driver, French aristocrat Saint-Chaffrey, knew his car was in trouble, so he made a proposal so shocking it would turn everyone in the competition against him. Abbott Collar, in her 2012 Smithsonian Magazine article titled Paris or Bust, the Great New York to Paris Auto Race of 1908, details the plan. Quote, "With 1 day to prepare, George Schuster searched for a supply of gasoline, which was scarce in Siberia. Back at his hotel, he received a note summoning him to Saint-Chaffrey's room. When he arrived, he saw that the Italian team was already there. 'There is no petrol,' the Frenchman announced. 'There are no means of getting any. What there was is in my possession, and I offer it to the car which will agree to take me on board.' The Italians left the room in disgust. Saint-Chaffrey tried to reason with the Americans, stating that he could get a seat on the German car, but the Flyer was sure to beat the Protos into Paris, and he wished to be on the first car to arrive. He added that it would not look well for a Frenchman to ride on a German machine. Schuster calmly said he'd think about it, but he was seething. Privately, he told his team that he'd rather stay in Vladivostok for the rest of his life than accept Saint-Chaffrey's bribe. Without fanfare, Saint-Chaffrey transferred the rights to his gasoline to the Italian team, but was not allowed to join. His sponsor, the Marquis Jules Albert de Dion, had decided he was finished." End quote. Yeah, so the thing about bribes is that you need to have ironclad upper hand. Had Saint-Chaffrey had the only fuel in the competition, that'd be one thing. But while finding gas was difficult in Siberia, it wasn't impossible, and that would be true on the route ahead. It's not like they would never be able to find fuel, but the search could potentially add a lot more time to each car's journey. And I think this is the upper hand that Saint-Chaffrey thought he had, but Saint-Chaffrey overplayed his hand like a granny at a Valley Forge casino. Except Granny is actually playing for something tangible. The journey continued with just 3 cars remaining as June finally arrived and the racers entered their 5th month of competition. After the railway pass, the Italian Zust car fell far behind, and the German Protos had gained the lead after spending virtually the entire first leg of the journey in last place. The Thomas Flyer was in 2nd place, but they were still a full day behind. Edwin Ross Thomas was concerned about Schuster's ability to finish, and the damage that a loss could potentially do to his E.R. Thomas Motor Company. And since the Grand Prix had already come and gone, Montague Roberts was now free to resume driving duties for the team if he wished. So a telegram was sent from the Thomas factory in Buffalo, asking Schuster if he wanted Roberts back on the team to finish the race. Give him a break from all that driving through Siberia. But upon reading this telegram, Schuster was said to have been mad enough to eat nails and sent a reply that declared the Thomas Flyer was making good time and would arrive in Paris by July 24th. But privately, Schuster was struggling. He wasn't sleeping. His entire body was sore. He was suffering from deadened nerves. Yet he felt he had to finish this race himself. He had something to prove. And the next 10,000 miles saw Schuster soldiering on like a man possessed. Yet, despite his very best efforts, the first car to reach Paris would arrive 2 days after Schuster's prediction. And it would not be the Thomas Flyer. On July 26th, after 165 days and 22,000 miles, Lieutenant Koppen and the German Protos car arrived in Paris and crossed the finish line, having claimed victory in the Asia to Europe leg of the journey. But they weren't the official winners yet. The Thomas Flyer had 30 days to get to Paris, and Schuster was hell-bent on doing it. However, it was pretty much over for the Italians, as the Zust car had fallen so far behind in Siberia that they were statistically incapable of winning, although they could still finish, and the Italian team refused to give up. Surprisingly, as the Thomas Flyer made it into Berlin, they were celebrated by the people there, despite being the primary rival of their man, Koppen. And it seemed that the big reason why was that the motor club that hosted Schuster and his team were unaware of the penalty against Koppen. They thought their man had already won, so Schuster and his team were congratulated for doing their best, on the assumption that the Americans were fighting for 2nd place. And after that, what else could Schuster do but hit the gas and blaze a path towards the finish line? Of course, in no way was that final stretch easy. On the one hand, the Thomas Flyer had held up better than any other car, despite all of the repairs it had needed. The Flyer had used the same spark plugs for the entire journey, the engine's valves never had to be changed, and the crankshaft bearings were somehow still undamaged. But now the tires were wearing down, the clutch had to be removed twice for repair, the brakes were leaking, the motor mount was failing, and a bird had flown into the car and took out the driver's side headlight. But by God, Schuster was going to get his team to Paris. And that's what he did. When the Americans finally arrived in Paris to the roars of spectators, the Thomas Flyer was stopped by a police officer who said, "You're under arrest. You have no lights on your car." A legal oversight had caught the Americans right at the end because, in order to drive in Paris, both headlights needed to be operable. Some bystanders came out of a nearby cafe to protest the arrest, and it's said that one of those bystanders was a familiar face. Guy Boussier de Saint-Chaufré had traveled to Paris after withdrawing from the race in order to meet with race officials and host a champagne reception for the Thomas crew. And he was supposedly one of the bystanders who added their voice to the defense of the Thomas crew. But the police officer didn't care that they were in the middle of a race around the world sanctioned by Paris's own race committee. The law was the law, and the Thomas Flyer was breaking it. The Americans would be arrested and disqualified. There was no way for the Zeus to catch up in the next 2 weeks, so the German Protos would be declared the winner. Or they would have been, if not for a Frenchman on a bicycle who offered to give the Americans the headlight from his bike. Schuster took out his tools and tried to remove the light from the bicycle to place on the Thomas Flyer, but he couldn't get it off. The police officer moved to arrest Schuster, but the team came up with a compromise. What if we just put the entire bike on the hood of the Thomas Flyer? That way the car has 2 working headlights. The team mounted the bicycle onto the hood with the light facing out into the street. The police officer looked it over carefully and gave them the okay to proceed. The Thomas Flyer arrived at the finish line on July 30th, 1908, just 4 days after the German Protos, and with 26 days to spare, all while sporting the most ludicrous modification this side of Pimp My Ride. After 6 months and 22,000 miles, the Thomas Flyer had won the greatest race ever run, and were met with cheers from the crowd. Had the Thomas Flyer been disqualified, the Protos unquestionably would have won, as the Zeus took way longer to get to Paris than just 2 weeks after the German car. They didn't arrive until September 17th. Yet at no point in the journey did the Italian team ever give up, and they deserve respect for that. From start to the final car crossing the finish line, the race had lasted for over 7 months. The greatest race in the world had finally ended, but the story wasn't over just yet. While I couldn't find any details of what became of the French representatives like Baron Charles Godard and Guy Boussier de Saint-Chaufré, perhaps it's just as well that they became immortalized as legends and folk heroes rather than remembered as mortals. Or maybe it's just a disservice to these men by a media landscape that, not dissimilarly from 21st century coverage, doesn't stick with a story very long before dumping it for the next big headline. Antonio Scarfolio knew this as well as anybody, being a journalist himself for Il Mattino, the Neapolitan newspaper founded by the father who didn't want him to participate in the race in the first place. Scarfolio would return to journalism and publish a book about the Great Race in 1909, titled Round the World in a Motor Car. Lieutenant Hans Koppen would become a best-selling author in his own right in Germany upon publishing his book on the race, the similarly titled The World by Car. In fact, he became such a popular folk hero in Germany that he was credited with popularizing the toothbrush mustache that would become immortalized worldwide by Charlie Chaplin, who I'm using as an example here to avoid mentioning the other guy who famously wore that mustache. That's right, Groucho Marx. And Koppen did get those promotions in the army that he was after. 21 years after the race ended, he would retire as a major general, only a few years before passing away in 1948. Schuster, meanwhile, finally received the recognition that he had been rarely afforded in the newspapers during the first leg of the race. Everyone seemed to recognize that Schuster was the reason the American team won, such that when he actually offered Montague Roberts to drive the car for the victory parade, Roberts declined, telling Schuster that he deserved to be at the wheel. Interestingly, the race had drawn attention to the lack of road infrastructure in the United States, and it resulted in campaigns to develop a more comprehensive road network to connect the country. And while the interstate highway system was still decades away, it was clear that public opinions towards cars was changing. This is nowhere more evident than in the increase in sales for the Thomas Company following the Thomas Flyers' win. In fact, the Thomas Company was so unprepared for the unexpected growth that they were literally unable to meet demand. And that lack of preparedness ultimately eroded all the benefits the company had earned from the New York to Paris race. Well, that and the arrival of the Model T, which cost 1/10 of what the Thomas Flyer cost, and was manufactured by a company capable of meeting production volumes that were commensurate with demand. For his victory in the race, Edwin Ross Thomas promised lifetime employment to George Schuster for as long as the Thomas Motor Company remained in business, which meant he got an extra 5 years of work. Unable to meet demands and then priced out of the market entirely by Ford and other competitors, the Thomas Motor Company shuttered its doors by 1913. The 1907 Thomas Flyer that had won the race was nearly lost to history, passing through the hands of private collectors over the next 50 years. But in 1962, casino magnate and avid auto collector Bill Harrah tracked the car down and offered to buy it off of the Long Island Museum owner who had it. Harrah would just need to have it authenticated first, so he brought in then 91-year-old George Schuster to look the car over. Schuster was skeptical that it was the real Thomas Flyer until Harrah had the car disassembled. And there it was. The boilerplate steel frame, the telltale drill holes on the flywheel, repairs he had forgotten about in the decades since. Reportedly, tears filled his eyes as he realized that this was the car that had taken him around the world. A car he had taken around the world, because neither would have been able to do it without the other. Harrah purchased the Flyer and had it restored to the condition it had been in when it arrived in Paris, right down to the missing headlight. And a year later, at age 92, George Schuster was invited to drive the restored car, the car that had made him an automotive legend. The Thomas Flyer would be enshrined in the National Automobile Museum in Reno, Nevada, and it would be added to the National Historic Vehicle Register earlier this year. In July, actually, 117 years from the month in which the Thomas Flyer arrived in Paris. George Schuster himself would be immortalized as an inductee into the Automotive Hall of Fame in 2010, 38 years after his death in 1972. The following year, in 2011, a race was held from New York to Paris, retracing the route the original racers took. Among the competitors was Jeff Mall, the great-grandson of George Schuster. And while I couldn't find definitive information on who won, I can imagine it was fraught with far less peril than the driver's 1908 counterparts faced. But then, it's hard to imagine there ever being another race like this. There's infrastructure now, there are roads, there are gas stations, there's an AutoZone in virtually every town. There's also the tension of international relations making the prospect of a multinational road race somewhat dicey. But beyond all that, there's no recapturing the same spectacle and wonder that cars held in 1908. There's no way for a race today to be as influential as New York to Paris 1908 had been for the popularization of the automobile. its adoption by Western society, and its enduring status as a necessary component for existing in modern society. But even if the same reverence isn't possible now, the events of 117 years ago stand as a monument to what determination, engineering, ingenuity, and simple resilience can accomplish, and how, at one time, being a citizen of the world superseded citizenship in any one country. Thank you for watching. If RCR brings any sort of value to your week at all, please consider leaving a like, a comment, sharing the video, or even subscribing, and treating that bell icon like a car horn trying to scare off a pack of wolves. But if you love RCR Stories and want me to make more of these videos, Patreon is the absolute best way to keep these long-form automotive videos coming. You'll even get them early, along with other exclusive content you'll never see here. Thank you for supporting RCR with your viewership. And let me know what you think in the comments. Have a great rest of your week.
Hello, you've reached the end of the video. I'm proud of you. If you come this far, I know you want to go farther. RCR's Patreon has tons of more content and all the stuff that I can't get away with on YouTube anymore. It's fun, it's bawdy, and it's extra dirty. And for $1, you get all of it. That's it. Less than the cost of a Costco hot dog. $1, you get double the content. You know what else? If everybody who watched this video joined our Patreon, RCR would be unstoppable. There's no telling what we could do with your support. So please, go to the Patreon, join it. It's only $1. Thank you so much, and thank you for liking Regular Car Reviews.